Okay, quick review of what goes on during urine production in your nephron. So, afferent arteriole brings blood into your glomerulus. Filtration occurs. Anything small enough to fit through those filtration slits, those fenestrations of the capillaries, gets captured by the glomerular capsule, moves on into the proximal convoluted tubule. Anything that's large enough stays in the blood, goes to the efferent arteriole and into the paratubular capillaries, and then maybe the vasa recta if this is a juxtaglomerular nephron. And those capillaries will be there to exchange with the tubules. Proximal convoluted tubules show a lot of reabsorption of nutrients and solutes, so glucose and sodium and whatever else we want to bring back in. We pump back into our interstitial fluid and then back into these capillaries here, and water follows. So we have a lot of reabsorption of water as well. Then we go into our nephron loop, and as we go down in the descending loop, we get into the medulla. It gets saltier and saltier out here, so water leaves via osmosis, gets picked up by the vasa recta. And as we go up, water is not able to move anymore, but sodium is pumped out actively from the ascending loop. So reabsorption of water and of sodium. Thus far, this reabsorption of water has been obligatory. It will always happen this way, no matter how dehydrated or hydrated you are. Then we get to the distal convoluted tubule, where there's a lot of secretion of stuff that might be in your blood. We're pumping it into the filtrate, so things like toxins and drugs. We may have secretion of some potassium if we are reabsorbing sodium, for instance, because those go in the opposite direction. And then we will also have, starting in the distal convoluted tubule and then continuing especially in the collecting duct, we will have facultative reabsorption of water. Right? So if we are hydrated, we will not reabsorb water. Right? The water will continue on down here because these walls are relatively impermeable to water. But if we are dehydrated, we will produce antidiuretic hormone, which causes the cells that line this collecting duct to produce aquaporins, which are water channels, which make this wall now permeable to water. And as you move down into the medulla, it's saltier and saltier out here. The water is going to want to move back out, and you end up with very concentrated urine, much less of it. And again, that concentrated urine you can tell because it's going to be a much more distinct color. If your kidneys cannot perform the functions that we've been talking about, which are necessary to maintain homeostasis inside your body, lots of problems can occur. So starting with reduced urine production, but within your body, you may have disturbed fluid balance, too much or too little fluid. You aren't able to regulate your pH. Your ion concentrations are off, which means, based on all that you learned in Bio 151, your muscle contractions or your neuron action potentials could be thrown off. You could end up with high blood pressure, right? Because you're not able to get rid of as much sodium and fluid. Erythropoietin is what causes you to produce red blood cells, and that's produced in your kidneys, right? Again, if you have ion imbalances, you could have nervous system problems. Renal failure can be chronic, which means problems are accumulating over time, and you're sort of having a slow deterioration of your kidneys. In this case, you can slow progress, but you cannot reverse it. You're probably going to be on a particular diet with restricted water, salt, protein intake, things like that. You can also have acute renal failure. So maybe you have had trauma to your kidney, right? You fell and whacked it, or some toxic drugs, or some obstruction in the blood vessels that lead to your kidneys, or whatever causes a sudden deterioration of your kidney. This is very quick and very dangerous, but partial or complete function recovery is possible if the patient survived the incident and you're able to fix the underlying problem. And there is a survival rate that's not great, but about 50% with supportive treatment. Well, if you have renal failure, especially chronic renal failure, how do you fix it? Well, there is no fixing it except by transplant, but you can treat the symptoms using hemodialysis. So while osmosis is the diffusion of water across a membrane, dialysis is a term for the diffusion of solutes across a membrane, and we use this process of dialysis to filter your blood. So essentially, you shunt your blood out of your body and run it into a machine that takes your blood and puts it across a dialysis membrane from a solution that is created specifically with contents to make sure that after prolonged exposure and diffusion is allowed, your blood is cleaned out, essentially. So in other words, organic wastes like urea, there are none in this dialysis fluid. So they diffuse from your blood over here, and by the end of the diffusion process, your blood has far fewer organic wastes. That said, things like ions, like sodium, or things like glucose, you're going to have lots of them in this dialysis fluid, or at least as many as you want in your blood, because you don't want glucose diffusing from your blood to the dialysis fluid. You don't want too much sodium diffusing from your blood to the dialysis fluid. So if you take a look at dialysis fluid, right, you'll note that it looks essentially like we want your blood plasma to look, right? So that after diffusion, your blood plasma looks more like the dialysis fluid. And this is a very basic animation showing the blood being removed from the arm, sent with as much surface area as possible through the dialysis fluid, and so diffusion is allowed, and then the blood is returned back to your blood. Now, dialysis can, help support a person and help them combat symptoms, but the only real treatment for renal failure is a new kidney, right? And we have gotten pretty good at kidney transplants. Patient survival is more than 90% at the 2-year mark, which is, for transplants, that's very, very good. You have to use immunosuppressive drugs to prevent rejection. The only issue is there are not that many kidneys available, right? So if you know someone who is a match for you, they can, donate you a kidney, which is obviously asking a lot of somebody, but you can survive and thrive even with a single kidney. It tends to increase in size to make up for the lost capacity. And some people choose, and I would encourage everyone to do so if you're able, to put themselves on an organ donation list. You can put it on your driver's license, and that way, if something ever happens, right? If I were to get in a car wreck and die tomorrow, my organs would go to someone else who can use them. All right, we've talked a lot about how urine is produced inside the kidneys, but what happens to it afterwards? Well, it drips from those papillae into the minor calyces, which then come together to form major calyces, and those dump together into this renal pelvis, which is the funnel that takes all of the urine and dumps them down into the ureters. The ureters are a passageway to the bladder. Bladder stores urine until you can move it through the urethra and out to the outside of your body. And a pyelogram is a way where you can image this, right? So you can see your minor calyces, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureters, bladder, etc. The urethra then extends from the bladder to the outside. Up until this point, the anatomy is fairly similar in males and females. Here it's pretty different. Females have a much, much shorter urethra than males do, as we'll talk about more as we get into chapter 26 and 27. But you can see the bladder has to come, or the urethra has to go through the prostate and all the way through the penis and out in the male, whereas in the females it just sort of drops right down there. The bladder has rugae, which are folds that are very similar to what we talked about in the stomach. And just as in the stomach, those rugae are there when the bladder is empty, and as the bladder gets full, those folds begin to disappear. You also have what's called a trigone, which is 3 holes. 2 of them are incoming, right? Your openings of your ureters, right? 1 coming from each kidney, so you have 2 of them. Those bring the urine in, and then you have 1 that is the exit hole for the urethra, and this would be a male because we're going again through the prostate. You also have a muscle around here. This is smooth muscle, so you do not have voluntary control over it. And it's actually a combination of muscles, but together we call them all your detrusor muscle. And then in here you have both an internal and an external urethral sphincter. That internal urethral sphincter, like the detrusor muscle, is smooth muscle, which means you do not have voluntary control over it. But fortunately, you do have voluntary control over your external urethral sphincter. Much like your external anal sphincter, this is what allows you to hold it when you need to hold it. Like most hollow tubes and organs, the inner layer is epithelial, right? It's a mucosa. In this case, we have transitional epithelium, which, if you remember from Bio 151, is able to stretch out, right? It's a special property of it. The middle layer is smooth muscle. In this case, that's the detrusor, once we get into our bladder, but you also have one in your ureter. And then the outer layer is just connective tissue that is continuous with the peritoneum. Urination is a fancy word for peeing, but an even fancier word for urination is micturition. And so the reflex that that governs when you pee and when you don't pee is called your micturition reflex. And you have, again, this is a lot like your feces storage and elimination. You have a local reflex pathway and a central nervous pathway. The local reflex pathway literally just is the stretching of the bladder. When you stretch a certain amount, it causes the internal urethral sphincter to relax and the detrusor muscle to compress, and that increases the pressure in your bladder and causes you to pee if you didn't have an external urethral sphincter, which fortunately you do to hold it. The central pathway sends that bladder fullness to your brain so that you are then aware of the fact that you have to pee, and you can hold it, meaning maintain your the tension in your external urethral sphincter, or you will have to voluntarily relax that sphincter that will then allow the urine to leave. And this is a nice general look at the local reflex as well as the long reflex, which sends it back to your brain and makes you aware of that. How do you know if something's going wrong with your kidneys? Well, very often the amount of urine that you're producing can tip you off. Polyuria is excess urine production. It means you are peeing way too much. And this could be a result of a number of problems, but very often it's diabetes, because diabetes means excessive blood sugar. And if you have excessive blood sugar, you're going to have excessive glucose also in your urine. And because water follows solutes like glucose, that means you're going to have excess fluid in your urine, which means more urine. You're going to pee all the time. That's one of the first tips that you might be diabetic. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have reduced urine production, we call that oliguria, right? Like an oligopeptide is just a small number of amino acids. An oligosaccharide is a small number of sugars. An oligarchy is ruled by a small number of people. Oliguria is reduced urine production. Anuria means essentially zero urine production, and that means you may have kidney failure and you need to get that looked at ASAP. If you feel like you have to go all the time, it could be because you have some irritation in the lining of the bladder or the ureters. If you have an inability to control your urination, that could have to do with the muscles that govern that. If you are unable to get rid of your urine, well, you can end up with a lot of issues. In men, this is less often an issue with the kidney, and more often, especially in older men, an issue with the prostate. So as we saw, the urine has to go through the prostate to get out, right? The urethra goes right through it. So if your prostate swells, that can cut off or make much smaller the passageway for the urethra, and that could be normal swelling, or it could be cancer in the prostate. If you have pain when you are peeing, or dysuria, so painful or difficult urination, this can be associated with an infection in your kidney, or it could be associated more often with kidney stones, which pop up often when you are dehydrated a lot. There are crystals that precipitate, and they can be very, very painful. If your kidneys are not working very well, you may notice that because you're not getting rid of fluid, you'll have swelling or edema in certain places, and often this has to do with infection, and so you can have a fever as well.